welcome to another sewing tutorial. So today I'll be talking about how I draft patterns. As a disclaimer, I have never had any formal training, so this is all techniques that I've learned on my own. So there's a few different methods on how I make my patterns. I'll walk you through them, starting with some of the easier methods. So first, some important things to keep in mind while you're pattern drafting. Number one is fabric type. Basically, does it stretch or does it not?
Patterns with stretch materials won't necessarily need things like zippers, darts, and the patterns are often smaller and more fitted. If I made the top on the left in a non-stretch fabric, I probably wouldn't be able to get it on.
Number two to keep in mind is seam allowance.
Seam allowance is the amount of fabric that will be sewn inside your garment, in the seams, or as part of the hem. It's important to add into your pattern so you don't lose length or width.
So the third thing you have to keep in mind are any folds in the fabric. So this would be things like darts, pleats, ruching. So these will often change the shape or the width of the pattern. For pleats, I like to use this website to draft my pattern. This website will tell you how much fabric you need to be able to have the type of pleats you want. The last thing to keep in mind are any extras. Are there zippers, pockets, buttons? These would have to be drawn into the pattern as well.
Here's all the tools you'll need to pattern draft. I always like to use tissue paper to draw my patterns on. I prefer this to regular paper in case I need to trace anything. And next, you'll always need a good pair of scissors to cut out your patterns. You'll also need a measuring tape and a ruler. Having a ruler helps you get nice straight lines when you're making your patterns, and the measuring tape is good for when you want to measure your body. You can also buy curved rulers specifically for pattern drafting. I just don't own one myself. And you'll also need something to draw or write with, so a pen, pencil, or some chalk.
For my pattern drafting methods, the first method I like to use is making patterns from clothes that I already have in my closet.
For this technique, I'll just trace my clothes one section at a time onto tissue paper, making sure to add the seam allowance.
Essentially, you can just trace any of your clothes, adding in seam allowance or anything I mentioned before, and it becomes a pattern. And the second method I like to use is using existing pattern pieces and modifying them or adding a few together.
Any pattern or pattern piece I make, I like to keep in this bag. When I've got a completed design, I will look through these pattern pieces and see if there's any that I can use or modify to make up that new design. This sleeve pattern I'll use for almost any sleeves I make. I've got it marked where to cut if I want skinnier sleeves or short sleeves. I also love this vest pattern, which I used to make this top here by extending that front section down and turned it backwards to make this top and modified that front section.
There's also something called a pattern block, which you can make and use that to make essentially any pattern. But I personally prefer other methods. And the last method is making patterns from scratch. It's easier if you're trying to make clothes for yourself or if you have a mannequin.
I always like to sketch out my designs in Procreate first, and you can easily find these crocus templates online. And I'll just sketch my design out, marking all the seams. And for example, this shirt that I made, I used my vest pattern for the upper part of the front and the back of the top, used my sleeve pattern for the sleeves, and then for the bottom, I made up my own pattern using my body measurements, and this was pretty simple because it's essentially just a big rectangle. So here's an example of how I drafted this pattern for a wrap top. I used the sleeve from another pattern, and then I took my vest pattern and measured how long I wanted the top on me and cropped it to that length, adding an inch in seam allowance. And then I took my own measurements of how far I needed the top to wrap around, marked out where the shoulders and sides seams would be to match up to the back, then took my ruler and measured out how long I needed that front piece to be. And then measured out a piece for the tie based on those earlier measurements.
Alright, so that's how I draft my own patterns. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.